Because of that delay?
Because of that delay, by the time we got to Children's Hospital, one side of her brain had already started shutting down.
Wow.
So at that point, they ran tests to see if there was anything that they could do, but there really wasn't anything. They couldn't reverse it. Everybody's like, oh, the pain, it fades. It doesn't fade. Because every year is another year that I don't have her for her birthday and holidays. And, yes, it's nice that we get to go visit her gravesite, but that's all I get to do.
Hey, it's Jordan. I am in Flint, Michigan, East Palestine, Ohio, Tumwa, Iowa. Please support the only independent outlet on the ground covering what the corporate media covers up. Hey, it's Jordan. I'm happy to be joined by Tabitha Toy. We've been covering a lot since the murder of the United Healthcare CEO, the healthcare industry, and predatory fraud. One aspect that unfortunately you've had to live with tragically is hospitals, the severe understaffing, which is in large part result to corporate seizure of our hospitals. And tragically, you've lost a 4-year-old daughter back in 2016 and have been fighting for some semblance of justice since then. Let's get into the story first. Your daughter, Tina, was 4 and she had a twin sister. Is that correct?
Yes.
And they were born with Down syndrome, correct?
Yes.
So tell me about at age 4, she wasn't feeling well. What was she exhibiting? What was she exhibiting, and what did you do next?
So originally she had vomited. So for me, she exhibited like flu-like symptoms. I kept her home that day, and then the next morning when she woke up, she was just very tired and she didn't want to get up, very lethargic. So I had called and made an appointment. Like I was told I had to make the appointment. And then I brought her in later on that day. They checked her out. I believe they did a strep test, said she had strep, went to go get medication to send us home. And when they left the room, she started having a seizure.
And this was at your regular doctor?
The regular pediatricians, yes.
Had she ever had a seizure before that?
She had never had a seizure before.
Wow. So obviously the doctor wanted you to go to the hospital?
Yeah, so they had called the ambulance from there, and they did not allow me to go in the back of the bus with her to the emergency room. They told me I had to drive down the street because my pediatrician's office was down the street from the emergency room there. So they took her by ambulance. I had to drive up myself. Right around the time when school let out, so a little busy.
Why wouldn't they let the mother in the ambulance? Typically they would allow that.
Give me an answer. I just know that it was the red bus that they have, the fire engine bus. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if they had different protocol for that, but they told me I had to drive down to the hospital.
And what hospital was this that they sent her to?
Good Samaritan.
And that's Steward Hospital, which was kind of like a big chain in Massachusetts.
Yes.
Okay.
One of many.
So they get her in there. They get her in there.
I get to the emergency room. It takes me almost 30 minutes to get to the front of the line because the emergency room was so busy. There were so many patients. The waiting room was packed. When I finally got back there, my daughter was in a room by herself. There was nobody watching her. I walked in, she was laying on the bed. And pretty much it was how most of the stay was at that hospital. At some point, they had come in and told me that she needed to be transported because they couldn't deal with her pediatric emergency at that hospital.
Let me rewind. When you get into the room, nobody's in there. How long did it take for someone to tell you what was going on as far as her symptoms or health?
Well, nobody really told me what was going on at the hospital. I had very little interaction with the doctor and the nurses that had taken care of her. We sat in the room for about 2 hours. When she had gotten there, they had given her some medication for the seizure. And then they didn't check her again for another 2 hours for her vitals. And then at that point, the paramedic had come for the transport, and they told me that she was having trouble breathing, and that they wanted to intubate. They would allow the intubation. And
could you kind of paint a picture, because we're talking about a 4-year-old who's had a seizure. You're getting into the room, nobody's there with her, and then it takes another 2 hours for them to transport. Was the hospital just like super understaffed? What was it like?
I would have to say yes, because when I walked into the emergency room, I didn't see doctors and nurses standing around like would normally when you walk into an emergency room. It was like a ghost town. And there were plenty of patients to see, but it didn't look like there was a lot of staff. I was in the room with my daughter, and at some point her alarms had started going off, and someone had come into the room to shut them off, and she had wound up having like 3 episodes. So I had, voiced that to the person who came in, and all they had said to me was, I know they shut the alarms off and they walked out of the room. They didn't even check her.
So when you say episodes, more seizures she was having?
What I believe was more seizures.
And instead of like doctors rushing in, they turned off the alarms and went out?
And left, yes.
Wow. And at the time, were you, asking for a doctor to come in, asking for more immediate care? What were you doing?
There really wasn't anybody to ask.
Wow.
Like I said, I literally sat in that room for almost 2 hours without any interaction with anyone coming in and out of her room.
I mean, this is a dumb question, but for you, sitting there with your kid hooked up and no real medical care, I mean, you must have been panicking.
Yeah, I didn't know what else to do. I mean, all I wanted them to do was help my daughter and, get her to feel better so we could go home and so she could play with her sister.
And you later learned that the protocol for this hospital for kids under 8, I believe it was,
yes.
Was they should have transported her to another hospital pretty quickly, right?
Yes, it was supposed to be immediately.
So do you know why that didn't happen?
I don't. Nobody has ever explained that to me. The hospital itself has never reached out to me after her passing. So,
and just so people know, I mean, I've reached out to them, but I'm sure they'll just give me whatever statement they've already put out there. This is Steward Hospital. They have 12 wrongful death cases against them over a decade, medical malpractice cases against them, fraud, non-payment for services, goods and rent. They've declared bankruptcy, but I've looked a little bit into the CEO who had a lavish salary, and seems like a lot of other CEOs that try to cut, staff and services while gorging profits. All right, so your daughter was eventually transferred to another hospital, but by then it was tragically too late.
Yeah, so she was transported to Children's Hospital in Boston, and by the time we got there wasn't much they could do. I mean, they did intubate her right away, but it was mostly, they made her comfortable. We actually wound up having to wait for at least another hour because the paramedic wanted to intubate her. They wanted another paramedic in the back when we went to Boston. So we wound up waiting a total of 3 hours for transport.
Okay, so even when she was transported, there was more delays.
Yes. Yep. They did not want to intubate her for the transport. We had to wait for an hour for another paramedic to come to, assist with her in the back of the bus to the transport to Boston.
And did you ever find out what was the reason for that delay also? It seems like one delay after another.
Yes. So when Tina got sick, I could only make an appointment for her because I had received a letter a couple of weeks prior telling me that if my kids were sick, that I needed to take them to the doctor's office, and the doctor would decide if they needed emergency care.
Okay.
I think it was a couple weeks before that. I had taken both the girls in. They had an ear infection. So I had gone into the emergency room. We waited about 3 hours, and they were just like so overwhelmed. And so was I. So I picked up both girls. I threw the papers on the floor and I walked out. And 2 weeks later, I got that letter in the mail.
Wow.
So,
And when you got to the transfer hospital and there was nothing more they could do, were you told anything by doctors there, nurses there, that made you believe, you know, they messed up at the first hospital, or the
yes.
fact that there was a delay? There was because of that delay?
Because of that delay, by the time we got to Children's Hospital, one side of her brain had already started shutting down.
Wow.
So at that point, they ran tests to see if there was anything that they could do, but there really wasn't anything. They couldn't reverse it.
Mm-hmm. And since then, have you spoken with anyone to find out, any medical people to find out, like, if she got the proper care at the first place at Steward's, what should they have done that could have saved her?
My lawyer has all that documentation.
Gotcha.
That proves, yes, she would be here.
Because this seems to me to be pretty clear that with the proper care, she'd still be here.
Yes.
Okay, so she passed. You said that you could never get answers from Steward. What did you do? Obviously you were grieving, but since then, obviously you initiated a lawsuit. What was the response from Steward, if any?
They just denied everything. They've pushed the case out so far to the point where it seems like they pushed it out till right before they filed bankruptcy. We actually had a mediation date set, and then I think it was a week later they declared bankruptcy.
Wow. And obviously losing a daughter is really horrific and torturous, but you had her sister that's still here. So you were trying to juggle the grieving with raising your other daughter. Were you hit with hospital bills from Steward and elsewhere?
No, I was not. That was one thing that I did not have to worry about. The people over at Children's Hospital were great. They helped me through, navigating, trying to get her.
So since then, obviously, you initiated a lawsuit, so you were looking into the hospital. Can you tell me what you found out about Steward in particular? Because it seems like you were rushed in there and it was this skeleton crew with a ton of patients. Have you learned other horror stories about this hospital in particular?
Absolutely. There are so many different horror stories. There were over 500 malpractice cases. I'm finding out there were at least 15 wrongful death cases against them. And then the people who owned Steward Healthcare also owned the insurance company that covered their malpractice cases.
Wow.
So it was like 3 or 4 of the same executives that ran Steward ran Traco. So they allowed Steward to funnel money out of that account. So there isn't money for all the people who have injuries that are coming after to get retribution for their family.
Right. So basically it was just like United, who's buying up doctors' offices and small hospitals. It sounds like Steward was doing on a lower level, similar.
Yeah. Well, they started as Cartageas. They started buying Cartageas. They both bought those hospitals, and then he just expanded. I think he had 7 or 8 in Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm. And in some of the research I've done, there's been some kind of nurses and doctors, not by name, but who talked about how understaffed they were, stretched thin. Can you talk more about that? People kind of inside the hospital who have spoken out?
There's a lot of people they're angry. Nobody's listening to them. The nurses, they need things for patients. They're not getting the stuff that they need for the patients. I've heard horror stories about people not getting paid for weeks at a time.
Wow.
So, I mean, I understand it's very frustrating for, the healthcare workers as well as the patients that they're trying to take care of.
Right. Can you talk about your other daughter? Because you've been dealing, obviously, I mean, the pain doesn't go away of losing one daughter, but you have her twin sister. She's special needs, and now she's having health problems as well, correct?
Yes. Well, I mean, they were both identical. So that right there is a double-edged sword. I get to see what my beautiful daughter would look like, but no, don't get to know what her personality would be like. And when she did pass, she was nonverbal.
Mm.
So we didn't even get to hear her speak her first word.
Wow.
Now, Jasmine had started having seizures 3 years ago. It just an isolated incident. She had a seizure one night. I believe the first one she had a fever with. 1 year later, she has another seizure. And I insisted that she had an MRI to figure out what was going on with the seizures, especially after losing my daughter, in 2016. And she was diagnosed with Moyamoya disease.
What's that?
It gives her an increased risk of stroke. The blood vessels to her brain the blood doesn't flow very well. So now we have to go and have another test, and then consult with the surgeon. And the only thing she can do is have surgery for it.
Wow.
So.
And I assume, based on what happened with Tina, you're not exactly so trustful of taking her to.
Not really. The only good thing is it is Children's Hospital. So Children's Hospital, I give them credit because they actually did try to save my daughter.
Right. I'd like to ask, because obviously you've been seeing the case with the United Healthcare CEO and the alleged shooter, that has opened the discussion about denial of care and delays of care and fraud and all this. But in your case, it seems it wasn't as much about denial of care in terms of reimbursement or getting it covered as just denial of basic humanity.
Yes.
I mean, your kid is having seizures. You walk in there, there's nobody in the room. When somebody comes in the room, they don't really give you many updates. They just turn off the noise.
Yeah.
Can you talk about, I mean, just what you've learned and other parents you've talked to since? Have other people experienced this where they're bringing their kids into hospitals and they're not really getting care and they're waiting and waiting and waiting and
for hours just to be seen in the emergency room, and then given maybe a 5-minute slot? Here you go, take some medicine, get out of here. And then there are others that just sit there and they just wait for hours and they don't get seen. There are a lot of people with kids. There are so many horror stories just from Steward themselves. So I can imagine how many horror stories there are for other hospitals.
And it's one thing if something happened, and even if she got the best treatment, there would be nothing they could do. But in this case, I mean, to live with that something could have been done to save her. It's got to be very difficult mental health wise for you, even 8 years later.
It definitely is. Everybody's like, oh, the pain, it fades. It doesn't fade, because every year is another year that I don't have her for her birthday and holidays. And, yes, it's nice that we get to go visit her gravesite, but that's all I get to do.
Right.
And her sister needed her. That was her best friend, partner in crime, two peas in a pod. They did everything together.
Right.
And then all of a sudden one day she just doesn't come home. And with my daughter not being verbal, it's difficult. Like she's a very empathetic girl. So like if she sees you being sad, she'll come right over to you, give you a big hug, even if she doesn't know you. she can get that energy off of you. If you're having a bad day, she just shows up and tries to
Hmm.
brighten your day.
Hmm.
So it's
And
just
I
difficult.
can I ask you? I know you guys have done a ton of research into the CEO of Steward. Uh, you found some, shall I say, unethical, fraudulent things.
Oh, absolutely. I actually was reading a story last night saying that, had they monitored them better, had the administration monitored them better, that we wouldn't be in this position with bankruptcy, because they knew pretty much back in 2014 that Steward was mismanaging funds. They were not fined for it. The governor administration from back then covered a lot of it up, and they basically tried to make everything look like Steward was doing great.
Was that Governor Baker at the time in Massachusetts?
Governor Baker, that's one of the articles that I had read last night.
Hmm.
Maura Healey, the current governor.
Wow.
Um,
And I take a wild guess that there's a money trail too of Steward funding politicians and whatnot.
Absolutely. Steward used to make their executives donate money to the politicians, and just so you can't turn around and say, okay, we're going to give all this money to these politicians, and then they're going to be lax on our rules and say, oh well, one has nothing to do with the other.
Right. Right.
That's too
And
many years. Like back in 2020 is when they really started getting into financial trouble, and you can't hide it for that long.
right. And also, in these cases, even if you can get a big settlement against the hospital per se, a lot of times the CEOs are shielded personally.
And
So you could,
I don't understand that. I'm actually looking into that myself, because there are a few little workarounds that may be possible, and if I can figure that out for myself and the other 500 plus people to have a course of action where we basically were just cut short once bankruptcy was filed, I will do that.
have you felt, I don't want to say optimistic because obviously there's nothing good about this, but has it at least been encouraging to you to see in recent years? I mean, I've covered nurses strikes in New York City and New Jersey. I know there's been strikes in Massachusetts. At least hospital workers, the rank and file, kind of fighting back against this understaffing, against, you see nurses that are supposed to have like 3 or 4 patients at a time having 7 to 8 at
And
least.
I do have friends that are, nurses and doctors. So I completely understand, but I'm glad that we're actually finally getting some of it out. It's been quiet for too long. People need to
Mhm.
know what's going on in healthcare.
Yeah. Tell us about Tina. I know she was nonverbal, but what kind of girl was she? I know she
Well,
was only 4, but
she was so happy. So Jasmine is empathic, but Tina went above and beyond with the empath. You know what I mean? Like she just knew. She was so happy. She loved trying to escape out of her little room and, bring her sister with her every single time. Like they were just so much fun. They had just started going to school, and they loved doing that every day, singing Wheels on the Bus while we were waiting. Me and their dad waiting for them on the bus, and then walking up the stairs with little songs that we would sing with them all the time. And I would have to say, for the first year after she passed, I couldn't listen to any of those songs, and that was so difficult with my other daughter, because
right.
that's all she wanted to do. But every time I heard them, I would start crying.
Yeah. And obviously you love your daughter now, but the reality is she's an identical twin, so you're getting that reminder all day long.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
What's your message? Because obviously the mainstream media, in response to the murder of Brian Thompson, Luigi Mangione, it's basically been like, yeah, we need some reforms here. We need to look at this denial of care and yada yada, but not really looking under the hood at the frankly immoral system. What's your
I think they need to change some of the legislature to make these companies more accountable. Especially if they're allowing hospitals to be self-insured. that's a big problem. You should be checking every single year, and there shouldn't be a case where they tell you, oh, well, I'm not going to give you my financials. Okay, if you don't give financials, then you don't get paid.
Right.
CEOs should not be getting paid. Steward back in 2016 sold all the properties to their hospitals and pocketed all that money. Instead of paying their bills, the CEO and all the executives got their dividends paid out. How do you put a company into bankruptcy when your dividends are getting paid out and you're not paying your bills?
Right. And I think it's important to say this is happening in Massachusetts, known as
Yep.
like a liberal bastion, right?
Yep.
And so this corruption happens in blue states, red states. People
Everywhere.
think it's the almighty dollar, and essentially, when you have corporations or wealthy people running hospitals, even these religious hospitals, I mean, it's kind of the wild west. They seem to be able to do whatever they want with
Right.
very limited regulation, and they kind of just, it seems to me, bake it into their balance sheet. Okay, we'll leave this much for the fines.
Most of these places are supposed to have a significant amount put aside if they are self-insured. And there should never, ever be, oh, let me borrow this money to go pay for this or do that. That money should never be touched. CEOs should never be allowed to touch it. And there should be something there. I mean, there has to be some sort of like conflict of interest if the Steward executives were running their own insurance company.
Lastly, could you tell us about your wrongful death lawsuit? I know your lawyer's not with you, but this has been delayed for years and years and years. What are you looking for in the lawsuit? I mean, money is nothing compared to your daughter, but what does the lawsuit allege, and what are the reasons for the delay?
Just basically that they cared for her properly. My daughter would be here without a doubt. Me personally, I want to know what these people have to say for themselves after going through this whole rigmarole of having to do depositions and all that. What do you have to say for yourself at the end of the day, knowing that my daughter would be here had you not had a bad day, so to speak?
Right. Well, there's nothing I could say to cheer you up, obviously, but I'm glad I could at least get this story out. I know Sabby Sabs also had you on, so credit to her. And I hope, I'm getting flooded in my email by other horror stories. I wish I can cover them all. But the most important thing, I think, is to keep this in the news and not, the mainstream media wants to move on. They don't want to cover the health insurance industry because, frankly, most of these outlets get advertisements. I'm sure local media, by the way, was doing advertising with Steward Hospital as well.
Yep. Like you've seen a couple of stories about Steward here and there, but it's kind of like they hushed everything. It came out and then it went away, and then nothing again until Luigi did what he did. Not for nothing, they're not leaving people much choice.
Well, I actually, in my book that came out last year, I revealed that there was in Flint, while the deadly Legionnaires outbreak was going on, there was a local ABC station that actually got documents from a local Flint hospital showing that they had an outbreak. They were going to do the story, and then magically the station killed the story. This was 6 months after the water switch when they could have exposed it. And then you find out, this hospital is a big advertiser to the local station. I can't say definitively that's why they killed the story, but 2 + 2 = 4. And you see similar things where local media runs ads from local hospitals and things like that. So there's just a lot of corruption baked into the system, and there's no reason if you go to an emergency hospital that you should be waiting hours and hours, that there should be not enough nurses and doctors. Frankly, these legislatures, if these hospitals are licensed in the state of Massachusetts or anywhere else, there needs to be laws for a minimum amount of staffing you need.
Yes.
Not set by the insurance companies, but the doctors and what they say they need. So I'm just so sorry for you and your family, and I'm glad we could get this out. And I'll try to stay in touch with you for sure.
Thank you so much.